In January, we asked former Guards officer Adam Holloway to live homeless on the streets of London, reporting for us with a hidden camera.
This side, there is a lens. The lens is the size of your fingernail.
When we left Adam 3 months ago, he was homeless, living off benefit. Now his search for a room exposes a new side to Britain's housing crisis.
Can you spare some change, please?
Adam ended up with a landlord who preys on the homeless, using taxpayers' money to maximize profits. His hunt for a roof over his head became a major investigation into exploitation, uncovering instances of fraud.
To begin looking for permanent accommodation, I did the obvious thing, applied for a council house. I began with Camden Council. How long do you reckon it will take if I register myself? A year?
Yeah, could be. I cannot tell you, there are many people on the list who have no priority. Priority is children and pregnancy, very, very bad medical problem.
Like most councils, Camden stopped building new council houses because of Mrs. Thatcher's policies in the early 1980s. Instead, the Conservatives were keen to revive the private rented sector, allowing housing benefit to be paid direct to landlords. So I went to a property agency that takes in homeless people. J Estates of Stamford Hill lets hundreds of rooms all over London to people on benefits. Hi, Mr. Lyons.
Yes.
My name's Adam Holloway.
Come in, sir.
Great. I was met by the property manager, Maurice Lyons. J Estates specialises in housing benefit customers, the homeless, the poor and the needy. Today the waiting room was full of Turkish refugees.
Sure, give me 5 minutes.
Of course, yeah.
Please.
I was less than reassured about my future landlords when I heard some of their tenants' complaints. Also, the electricity not working then? For 1 month?
1 month.
So what would you do for heating and cooking and that?
I can't cook, you know, nothing work is kicking and raining.
Have you asked them before?
No, four times.
And if councils are slow to pay up housing benefit, J Estates have a trick up their sleeve. They threaten to evict the tenant.
I know what I can do. This works very good. I give you a letter, notice to quit. You know what that is, the notice to quit? That, you know, I'm throwing you out with nothing. Then
because of you couldn't get any money.
Yeah, then it goes 1, 2, 3.
Great.
So I'll do that. I'll prepare it later on.
Okay.
See you.
How much do you pay for it? We've just got like 1 room or something. 75, that's a lot. Is that paid for by the government or whatever? There's no real competition for taking in homeless people, so a landlord can make inflated demands to local councils. Do you know how long it'll be until Mr. Lyons is available?
Go and get him for you right
Cheers.
away.
They want a letter from you confirming that I'm living in your property. Of course, I won't be when you give me the letter, but they don't
Do they
mind
want
about
to
that.
know what the rent is as well?
I think that will be the local council, won't it? Because they pay the rent, don't they?
Wait a minute. I can give you this, and you can take this with you if you like. This is just as good. Come here, man, look. This is to confirm that Mr. What are your initials?
Adam Holloway.
Adam Holloway is currently a tenant of property 52 Gloucester Drive, room 7, where the rent has been agreed such a date, £75 per week.
Right. And how does that work with the rent? Do you think they'll pay that much?
They don't have to. Well, they assess it.
Right.
They may pay 50 or 60, but we have to put a figure down. We don't know what to put down,
Okay.
so we put down the maximum and hope to get the best. Let me just make a copy of this and you can...
Okay, great.
Is that fair?
Yeah, that's great. The other thing is, what's the score on blankets and sheets and stuff like that?
We don't supply that.
You don't supply that? Okay.
No.
Right. Mr. Lyons offered me a room at 53 Gloucester Drive, one of 3 J Estates houses in the road. As far as I could gather, 10 people lived in the house, nearly all of them on housing benefit, paid by Hackney Council. Bathroom, what's that like? £75 a week doesn't buy you much in a J Estates bedsit. Right, not too bad, is it? It's a bit smaller, right? But the other one, I guess, is double, isn't it?
Yeah, this is for 1 person.
There was very little furniture, no cooking facilities and a broken gas fire. I used the curtains for blankets. Councils should operate strict checks to ensure they're getting value for money, but J Estates know how to get the maximum from the system. I make a check with other tenants. Hi, I'm Adam from next door. Tell me, how many of you are living in this room here?
2 people.
Right, and do you know what the rent is?
No.
You don't know how much rent you're paying?
It's £60.
60, what, a week? Each a week?
Yeah, each.
What, £120 a week by you or by someone else?
DHSS.
Oh, they know how the system works. They know how the system works, how much they're willing to pay out at the moment. And with the shortage of, like, council properties, they know that there's always going to be that market of people needing somewhere to stay. And this is ideal for either two unemployed guys on their own, an unemployed couple, anybody who's on social benefit, basically, and they know the amount they could possibly get top whack in excess of like £100 plus a week.
By having two people in it, yeah?
Yeah, by having two people in it.
He wanted £75 for me, £75 for my wife, for £50 for the baby a week.
In the end, Hackney pay £80 a week to house this family in their one room. And the gas was off here for how long?
Well over 6 months.
6 months? So how do you get heating in the middle of winter?
I had a 2-ring cooker.
But wasn't it cold?
Damn cold.
When I moved in, I had to show reference for my job. Then, I think around about that point, they discovered that if they got people from who were on the dole, they could charge them more, and they would be paid, and they could be paid direct by the council. So they didn't have the problem with people not paying the rent, and also they could get more money.
Environmental health expert Bill Page has inspected many J Estates properties in London.
Morning, Adam. Hi.
Hi.
Pleased to meet you. OK, Adam, well, these 3 houses have been managed by J Estates for a number of years now, and conditions obviously aren't satisfactory because the council have served a notice requiring, amongst other things, the installations in common use like bathrooms and toilets to be kept in proper repair and clean condition.
Are you aware of many other properties managed by J Estates in this kind of condition?
I certainly am. I've been in a number of their properties over the years, and they've all been in a similarly poor condition.
Well, let's take a look.
Right. Hang on, I'll have to squeeze in first. Well, Adam, this is the toilet and shower on the ground floor at the back. Obviously, that's been very seriously neglected. The cracked and broken tiles are just crumbling away there. There's one missing completely. If we move towards the back, the plaster is bare because the paper has just peeled away due to all the dampness. Broken lavatory seat, dirty toilet. The walls are just covered in mould growth. It's horrible. In fact, there's clearly no management here by the landlords whatsoever.
We surveyed other J Estates properties in the borough. Do Hackney Borough Council get value for money from J Estates? Their legal department consider that this property in Bethune Road to be in a substantial state of disrepair, and yet each week they spend £600 in housing benefits. That's the equivalent of over £30,000 a year to house the Kurdish refugees who live here, sometimes 4 to a room. Fairholt Road, the upstairs described by Hackney Council as being in substantial disrepair, and yet Hackney still pay £160 a week for the downstairs. That's £8,000 a year. The 3 Gloucester Drive properties, cash flow cows of the JS empire. Number 51 had no gas all last winter. Last June there was a repair order from Hackney Council. Nothing has yet been done about it by J Estates. I used to live here at number 53 Gloucester Drive. The combined rental income per week on these properties is £1,100. That's over £50,000 a year. Last year, Hackney Council alone paid £175,000 in housing benefits to J Estates, often for substandard rooms. So, who owns J Estates? It was founded in the 1960s by Joshua Meisels, a diamond cutter, now the rabbi of an Orthodox Jewish sect. By the 80s, he owned more than 60 property companies with houses in many London boroughs. But today, Mr. Meisels is a worried man. Once worth £100 million, he's now a victim of his own greed, borrowing too much to buy too many properties. His empire, which I've just joined, is in serious trouble with companies going into liquidation. World in Action researcher John Williams has been investigating the financial state of Mr. Meisels' property companies.
This is a sort of schematic representation of the empire. It's a house of cards, literally. We've got Joshua Vilmos Meisels at the top, and through his holding company, Greysdale Investments Limited, he owns all these companies. But what you've got to remember is all these companies are interrelated. Assets of one company will be put up as security for loans made to other ones. And here we see this yellow card's a company in liquidation, and you can see that there are debts all across the group. £3.46 million here, nearly £1 million, these two.
So if one company goes down, others will go with it?
Well, indeed, and in fact, when a few of the companies go down, they bring others down with them.
And so these companies are basically portfolios of properties?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these companies own properties, and in fact, in a lot of those properties, there are going to be tenants, and I would imagine that as this lot crashes, they're going to be very worried about their own position.
Right. A failed attempt to manipulate housing benefits following the purchase of a tower block in 1989 in Bethnal Green marked the beginning of Joshua Meisel's troubles. A company which he half-owned paid just over £1 million to Tower Hamlets Council for Bacton Tower. Plans to sell the flats at a profit failed, so to pay the mortgage, Maurice Lyons of J Estates began bringing in homeless refugee families from outside the borough. Councillor Jonathan Stokes explains how they first found out.
Well, we were having a council meeting in here one evening, and we happened to be sat up the end there, and we just looked out and ran through the window, and the whole place was lit up like a Christmas tree.
When did you become aware that inflated housing benefit claims were being made to Tower Hamlets?
Well, we were advised by the Housing Benefit Claim Office that a number of claims were being made for a number of families in the block, all of whom seemed to have no connection with the area and had just moved in. And of course, the actual amount of rent they were claiming, so like sometimes 210, 280, over £300 a week for a unit, was very high indeed.
Bacton Tower is now empty, repossessed by a bank. Tower Hamlets refused J Estates' inflated claims of £300 a week per flat, but they had to rehouse many of the 52 families who'd been moved in.
That's what the Housing Benefit Officer decided in the end. It was her view and her decision that the claims were excessive in terms of the number, excessive in terms of the amount. And in fact, there is a specific part of the legislation which says if you think the claims are based on the idea of defrauding the system, then you're entitled to reject them, and that's what happened. Jays set out to break the system. They set out to take from the system every penny they could get by putting in families, by making inflated claims, in order to gain the benefit of the housing benefit system, to give them a very regular and indeed a very large cash flow, which they really weren't entitled to right from the start.
Mr Meisel's and his associates' cash flow would have been £800,000 per year from housing benefit for an outlay of just over £1 million. In a general statement, J Estates said, "We have never been paid any more money by the local authorities than what they deemed to be fair and proper for that particular property." Students have been living at this house in Hackney for nearly a year, yet during this time J Estates have continued to claim £76 a week in housing benefits for Mr H Signer, knowing he doesn't live here. So how long have you all been living here?
Well, I moved down in September.
Right.
I was here in June.
Right. Have you ever heard of a man called Mr H Signer? Because Hackney Council are paying £76 a week for this Mr Signer who you've never seen to live here.
Yeah, well, he hasn't been here, so...
You've never come across someone called Mr Signer?
Never met him, no.
Is Mr Lyons of J Estates still interested in the property?
Yeah, under the company name that he told us was Metro Launch.
I see. And does he ever come around here?
No, we haven't seen him since before Christmas. He came round when we first moved in and tried to get us out.
The students told me that following his visits, Mr Lyons was well aware of who did live at the house. For the last 6 months, J Estates have also been falsely claiming housing benefit of £180 a month for a Mr M Ozian at this address. I asked Rabbi Joshua Meisels if he'd ever heard of him. Does Mr M Oziani live here? I don't know. Has he ever lived here?
I don't know that. Why?
I'm just wondering whether Mr M Oziani lives here.
I'm not familiar with Hampstead. I'm only going to the synagogue.
Oh, I see. The building turns out to be Rabbi Joshua Meisel's synagogue. In their statement, J Estates said, "Overpayment of rents have either been returned to or deducted by the local authority." We wanted to learn more about J Estates, so posing as investors keen to buy into the business, we invited Maurice Lyons to a meeting at a London hotel.
What's the turnover roughly?
Oh, we're talking about sales or about rents?
Rents interest me.
Rents is the main thing. The turnover there at the moment is running at about, in commercial and residential, we're talking about between £500,000 a year, £1 million a year.
Good heavens.
Because we're doing it all through the government part.
That's what I want.
The residential's coming all through the housing.
The best tenant at the moment is the government tenant, aren't they? Are there problems with payment from the government?
No, that's excellent.
I mean, it's guaranteed in due course.
That's the benefit that I've given the company.
Exactly.
That's my expertise, and that nobody gets. I mean, all I've told you, but the experience that I've got in that, which that remains with me, because that's my trump card.
This is negotiating with local authorities.
Everything.
with, what else, government welfare agencies?
The works.
With the tenants?
The works.
The works.
15, 57 Melbourne, of course.
Buying and selling cheap tenanted housing at auctions was another way Mr. Meisels made money. Posing as a property speculator, I met Leslie Starr, his former house buyer, who explained J Estate's methods.
£25,000 for a flat in Kent.
The trick was to buy cheaply, get the tenants out and then sell for a quick profit. Many current housing benefit tenants are easy to remove, but longer-standing sitting tenants still have legal safeguards, so J Estates devised a technique known as the switch to deal with them. They would offer them money to leave. That offer was repeatedly reduced. The tenant, seeing their promised payment diminishing, would leave quickly before the sum shrunk further. But when they did leave, the money wasn't always paid. One of Maurice Lyon's tasks was to operate the switch.
Obviously, getting vacant possession and realising the capital on the vacant properties. In other words, buying it as an investment, getting it vacant, and that's where the cream and the honey came.
Right. Would you be willing to give them premiums to leave? Was that?
That was the general idea.
Was it?
The general idea was to buy them out,
yes.
But you had to do it in a very, very skillful way. You couldn't sort of come up and tell them, look, you know, this is what you want, but they knew what you were coming for.
Maurice Lyons deployed these skills to get Sarah Vickery out of this flat.
So why do you think they wanted you to move out and go somewhere else?
Well, they obviously wanted to sell the block, and it wasn't going to be worth very much with a lot of sitting tenants in it.
At different times, they offered you different amounts of money to move out. How did that work?
Well, initially they offered me £10,000. After I'd expressed an interest, they wanted to renegotiate, and it came down to £6,250. And finally, we settled on £4,500. But I still haven't got any money.
So it sounds to me as if, you know, you're a victim of the switch.
J Estates used other skills to try to get tenants out of number 38 Belmont Road in Haringey. Environmental health expert Bill Page.
I have to say that this is the worst house that I've ever seen managed by J Estates by quite a considerable degree. The fact that there are two sitting tenants in here has a great deal more bearing on the value than the actual conditions that exist here.
Wait a minute, so by saying that, are you suggesting that the landlord may have deliberately got this house into this condition and continued to allow it to deteriorate in order to get rid of two sitting tenants?
Well, it's difficult to understand why anybody would seemingly want to take off a reasonably sound slated roof covering. There's large gaping holes that have allowed gallons of water to pour through the house and have effectively rendered the top two floors of the house uninhabitable. The principal problems are associated with the fact that it must be colder in here than outside. We've got the situation where there's no lighting upstairs. The guys wandering around with candles. And apart from that, it must be completely soul-destroying having to live here. I can't imagine what it must be like to live here.
But there are people living in this house who refuse to be intimidated. In 1972, Anton Sequeira became a tenant. After the house was bought at auction by a J Estates company in 1986, Maurice Lyons offered him money to move. Then, in 1988, J Estates sent in the builders.
On the 12th of October, they came in and they started on my top two rooms. They knocked the ceiling off. The builders messed the whole place up, and it was going on up to December, and then they stopped end of December.
J Estates left the roof off. That was in December 1988. Maurice Lyons then made Mr. Sequeira another offer to get out, first of $25,000. Then the offer was reduced. Still, the roof stayed off.
Mr. Lyons was giving you more than £10,000 for what?
Move out.
For you to move out?
Move out, yes. So he can have the property. And then he changed his mind. And then he keeps ringing me up. Then I was a bit suspicious of him because he kept his word and I kept my word. And when the time came to move out, he just changed his mind.
What effect do you think all this has had on your health?
At times I feel like turning the gas on and just calling it a day, you know, because I couldn't take anymore. I just couldn't take anymore.
Haringey Council have now made a compulsory purchase of number 38 Belmont Road. They plan to rehouse Anton Sequeira.
Well, Adam, we've shown you how the companies are in trouble, but what we've got to remember is that many of the loans made to the companies will be backed by personal guarantees from Joshua Meisels himself, so he must be in some trouble at the moment. And in fact, we've managed to obtain a letter from his accountants, and
We would first of all inform you that Mr. Meisels is bereft of assets. His companies are now mostly in liquidation or be going into liquidation. Various banks have appointed receivers over their properties, and we're enclosing here with a schedule indicating the current amounts outstanding. What does that mean?
Basically, it means that he's in big trouble. There's a lot of money been lent. His asset base has shrunk enormously, and the banks want their money back. Now, we've managed to get hold of that schedule as well, and I'll just show you the sorts of amounts of money we're into here. As you can see, you've got the State Bank of South Australia in for £8 million, the Woolwich in for £4.2 million, National Westminster Bank in for £1.5 million, and as you can see, the total borrowing is £38.3 million. Now, remember, this is June 91. So even way back then, his companies were into an annual interest bill of over £4 million a year. Now, that's just to stand still. So the state of financial health, even back in June 91 and possibly before that, must have been pretty ropey.
When I first went to J Estates, I made an agreement with Mr. Lyons to move later to a room in Manchester Street, one of their West End properties. But Manchester Street has problems all of its own. J Estates have sent me here to 33 Manchester Street. The rent is £75 a week, and I have a 6-month tenancy agreement. We've just learned that this property is an asset of Fosbourne Estates Limited, which is in liquidation. I wonder where that leaves me and the other tenants who are living here. Fosbourne Estates Limited, of which both Joshua Meisels and Maurice Lyons have been recent directors, went into liquidation in February. Any rent from the company's properties should go to the liquidator, but I just signed a rental agreement with J Estates. I checked with the other tenants. They're still paying to J Estates. What do they charge you per week?
£40.
Right. Have you been paying that money to J Estates since February of this year? When was the last time you paid J Estates?
A week ago yesterday.
So have you paid any money to J Estates since February of this year?
Yes, I have.
How often?
Once a month.
So you've paid rent to them since February?
Yeah, all the time, yes.
So I spoke to Melvin Langley from Sawskeys, liquidator of Fosbourne Estates Limited.
I'm totally surprised. This is in breach of the Companies Act and the Insolvency Act 1986. I am the liquidator of the company, and I have responsibility over the company's assets. I've spoken to the directors and advised them, or shall I say the ex-directors, and advised them that they should account to me immediately for all monies and a full report of their actions, failing which legal action will ensue.
There are hundreds of tenants, often the most needy, existing on benefits in houses all over London managed by J Estates. Suddenly, they're at the mercy of the banks and the receivers because of what happened here 10 days ago.
Today in the Chancery Division of the High Court, Joshua and his wife Minia Meisels were declared bankrupt.
As a bankrupt, Joshua Meisels is now barred from acting as a company director. Weldon Action asked Joshua Meisels and Maurice Lyons for an interview. They both declined. So, finally changing from a housing benefit tenant, I revealed myself as a reporter to Maurice Lyons outside his flat.
Hi. Mr. Lyons, is not your special skill the practice of what you call the switch, where you offer people large sums of money to leave properties and then when they move out, don't pay them?
You'll have to see me in my office about that. I'm not working. I'm going to see somebody who's sick.
What about Sarah Vickery at Eve Court? Was she a victim of what you call the switch? Was Sarah Vickery at Eve Court a victim of what you call the switch?
You're talking to the wrong person.
Who should I talk to?
Not me.
Are you not the property manager? Are you not the person who's dealt with her? Are you not the person who sent all the letters? Do you ever use more extreme practices, such as removing the roof from people's houses?
You're now live with me. I know nothing about that.
You know nothing about that? You've never had anything to do with that? You've never been involved in managing it?
No.
Mr. Lyons, were you not the property manager at J Estates responsible for housing benefits for Mr. H. Signer from Hackney Council when he wasn't living there and you knew it? Has J Estates been receiving money from Hackney Council in housing benefits?
At the moment, I'm going to visit.
Has Hackney Council been sending cheques to you for housing benefit? Watch out, you're going to hit a car. I paid my outstanding rent to the liquidator and moved out of Manchester Street for good. In their haste to revive the private rented sector, the government have all but privatised the problems of homelessness. Rather than put people in council housing, they're now driven to large private companies like J Estates. The unsuspecting tenant now faces new hazards, bad landlords, intent on profit, who can go bust at any time in recession. As for me, I'm returning to my old life. Meanwhile, thousands of people remain on the streets of our country, victims of a housing system that doesn't work at all for them and therefore can't care.